Thanks, Victoria. So, yes, I'm going to start and Victoria's going to finish. And Victoria rather modestly put her name last on this paper, but I think she's really the prime creative and research factor in this whole piece of work. So what we want to talk about is essentially the Berwick Metrotown, a short-lived project that existed on the eastern edge of the rapidly expanding city of Melbourne in the early 70s. It's continued to have some impact today, but essentially, as is so often the case in this sort of situation, the actual plan didn't really come to fruition. It has the whole project has a lot of tendrils into planning for the period of like 50 years ago, I guess. A time of, there was a lot of innovation proposed and some actually undertaken at this time in Australia. And it has, even though this is essentially a local government initiative, it also has some ramifications and resonances with what's going on at the state and federal level in Australia at the time. So, Victoria, can we have the next slide, please?
Yep.
So this is our outline, which I won't read out to everybody, assuming that that's fairly straightforward. I keep getting stuck on that last point, unideal, which I keep reading as unideal, but unideal outcome. And yeah, I think we could say we did actually have an unideal outcome in this situation. We also get that's a really good indication there in that graphic of where Berwick lies in relation to the city itself. And at this time in let's say 50 years ago, right on the edge of the city. And I imagine that for many Melburnians, Berwick is still thought of as being right on the edge of the city, but in fact it's encompassed by an enormous amount of suburban development these days. So let's look at the next slide, please, Victoria. There's a lot of issues here, which I guess, apart from anything else, I don't feel like I have time to go into in great detail, but there's a lot of unease, let's say, then as now, about the suburban expansion of particularly the two largest cities in Australia, Melbourne and Sydney. And that unease has only grown with a distinct lack of capacity or ability or desire to make the changes at federal or state level. Any sort of definitive projects that try to address this kind of expansion of those two cities really has tended to fall down for various reasons. But Australia is a very urbanized society, and Melbourne is not just the second largest the second largest city in Australia. It's also had this issue, which is, of course, has ramifications for access to the centre, of being extremely lopsided, which is stretching out to the east, which has been the case for well, probably since the 1870s. So the growth has always been to the east. Let's look at the next slide, please, Victoria.
Sorry.
The site context. So there again, we see Berwick sitting right on the edge, a fringe location. It's essentially farmland. Historically farmland. Of course, before farmland, it was a whole different kind of terrain, but we won't go into that. And then maybe we'll look at the next slide. So we see Berwick, which was seen by the Metropolitan Board of Works, which was the chief planning body in Melbourne at the time, seen as a space capable of accommodating population growth, as long as the city was going to keep spreading out to the east. Because the south and the east were generally seen as more pleasant and more desirable areas, perhaps more suited to residential living. Let's look at the next slide. This demarcation, I suppose, of a Berwick corridor was especially robust with a large range of services. It stretched out to Gippsland, where there was a big primary industry, largely in coal, but a few other, agricultural and related industries. And highways to Gippsland provided good access to the Berwick corridor. A railway to Warrigal was in place, which passed through Berwick, and that had been electrified in the 1950s by the State Electricity Commission. We're lucky here to have some really nice images from a 1974 thesis in our library at our university that show us what the landscape looked like in this early 1970s time. So the next slide, please, Victoria. The context here in the early 70s is that the federal government under Gough Whitlam had, and this is going to be covered again in some of our other papers over the next couple of days. The Department of Urban and Regional Development, DURD, had a New Towns program in the early 1970s that, some of which actually led to achieved goals, notably Albury-Wodonga and Macarthur, and many of which ended up not really getting very far at all, and the whole thing didn't really last more than about 3 years. But also had ramifications for state planning bodies and so on after that time, and there was sort of aftershocks, to use a term that we're thinking about a lot in Melbourne at the moment, having just endured our greatest earthquake in recorded history yesterday. There are a lot of aftershocks to the DURD New Town program as well, which Victoria and I and Rob Freestone and some others investigating at the moment as part of a Australian Research Council funded project. So the Metrotown concept, which became to be applied to Berwick for a brief period, roughly at the same time as the Department of Urban and Regional Development's New Towns, was kind of it tapped into some of the same founding principles of the New Towns program. There's often talk about British New Towns by the people promoting the Berwick New Town development, although I think that what was being proposed at Berwick was, in a manner of speaking, its own thing, or at least it drew from many other possibilities around the world at that time. And Victoria's going to talk about some of those. I'm thinking particularly about the transport concept, but it was certainly, part of the vibe of the period. And certainly the people of Berwick, or the local government of Berwick, tried a number of times to get DURD interested in possibly funding its proposal. If we can just go to the next slide, please, Victoria. So one of the initiating instances here was Lord Casey of Berwick, this sort of slightly unusual figure who was a lord in the British style, but who lived at Berwick and was an Australian, made a lord for his war service. He initially had a kind of a thought about turning his country pile into an education precinct. And from discussions around this and the bringing in of the planners Loder and Bailey into the picture to look at designing this education precinct, this sort of seemed to get things started and get people thinking about potential uses and potential, I guess, the potential character of the development of the Berwick area. And I guess we look at the next slide. Victoria, thanks. So this was a time of rapid period of policy formation. There's a 1967 plan by the Board of Works, formalised in 1971 as planning policies for the Melbourne metropolitan region. So there are factors when it comes to Berwick. It's like, do we embrace the inevitable and develop Berwick in a certain way, or do we try to resist the further spread east? And it was in 1971 that the Shire of Berwick came under the Board of Works jurisdiction in respect to planning. The next slide, please, Victoria. So the Loder and Bailey are already involved in Berwick and were then engaged to create a plan by the newly minted City of Berwick to try to challenge the normative suburban development permitted and generally facilitated by the Board of Works. And there was a plan put in, sort of proposed, that had a kind of a satellite identity, a strongly maintained green belt, and a capped population of 90,000 rather than the Board of Works suggestion of 150,000, to try and stop it becoming a rural periphery converted to status quo suburbia. It was a conscious and ambitious attempt by local government to cater for an expected major population and employment growth with the form of a new town, a peripheral centrality in several ways. It would be self-contained and balanced. It would have a peripheral outer suburban local government within the Victorian local government system. So there'd be human resources, the best planners and the best chief executives available. And it would be the locus for an innovative thinking regarding strategic, spatial and transport planning. The next slide, please, Victoria. So these strategies for the 1971 policy were finessed and potential areas were investigated. A legislative mechanism was necessary to declare these formal investigation areas and to minimise the scope for land speculation in these areas, where buyers would be purchasing low-cost farmland under the assumption that later rezoning would result in a large windfall. To cut a long story short, this is actually what eventually happened with the local government's approval after a change in local government. So the next slide, please, Victoria. So foreshadowing the issues leading to the concept's demise, the Metrotown covered a significant amount of land. The Berwick City Council, as it came to be known or came to be created, would need to compulsorily acquire an amount of land totaling 5,819 acres across 160 land holdings. The next slide, please, Victoria. And the venture would be profit-driven, but looking at a kind of a land capture model, taking inspiration from Albury-Wodonga, one of the successful DURD New Towns, and would create its own development corporation with a state government representative, 2 from the City of Berwick, 1 from the neighbouring Shire of Pakenham, and a number of others. Let's move on to the next slide, Victoria, please. So I think you're going to take up the story from here on, yeah?
Yep, I'll be talking about the kind of, I guess, features and services that were planned for the actual Metrotown, which really drive home the idea of it being a central point on the periphery, an actual urban settlement centred around like a civic centre. So it's quite novel to that point in time and for the context as well. And I just wanted to emphasise that Loder and Bailey did have a pedigree of social planning as well as transport-oriented planning, which very much comes through in the plans for the Berwick Metrotown. One of the most interesting parts is the very early adoption of a accessible transport infrastructure being the on-demand bus. And this is emphasised quite clearly throughout all of their preliminary and final plans, that any sort of tyranny of distance that comes with living on the periphery would effectively be remedied by an on-demand bus service that you call and that would arrive to your door and take you to wherever you need to go. How they intended to fund that, I'm not entirely sure, but these sorts of networks would have centred on the actual civic centre of the town. And it's actually something which the Public Transport Corporation today is adopting in outer suburban areas. So interesting that Loder and Bailey preempted that quite early on. But that kind of leads to the much more interesting part of it, which is very much in the almost, I guess, like novel entrepreneurial spirit that some new towns have. And this reminds me of North Bucks New City. which would have been the predecessor for Milton Keynes, in that very early on, this weird idea of a monorail being the main way of getting around, augmenting that on-call public transport network, basically serving what purpose cars and roads would have served while still sort of maintaining the two. So John Loder was actually really interested in all sorts of crazy ways of moving around. He actually patented a kind of conveyor belt system for human beings in public areas. So for him to propose this kind of scheme wasn't too wild. Basically, it was a captive loop containing a kind of conveyor belt with pallets on it, and you'd be able to drive your car onto it. You'd be able to put your cargo on it. You could fit up to 5 people on one of these little personal automated transport solutions. And he effectively thought that this would one day augment and then perhaps override the need for the car. So it's interesting looking at plans for the Metrotown as kind of facilitating the adoption of this method of movement, even though ultimately it wasn't pursued based on cost alone. I think the entire system would have cost roughly about $2,000 million. So with transport in mind, it's really fascinating looking at the plan and just seeing how much of it was oriented around facilitating movement in a way that we never really see beyond the city's periphery, and in a way that's probably much more akin to the central city. So this map shows the sheer amount of grade-separated pedestrian crossings that Loder and Bailey would have implemented throughout the Metrotown. I believe there wouldn't have been more than 30 pedestrian crossings throughout the entire township, with the rest just being pathways under or over roads. So a very sort of human-oriented way of planning for movement. And slow streets were encouraged as well, with John Loder also demonstrating an interest in how to mitigate movement and sort of minimize risk in a sense. So designing streets to make sure that access was still possible, but not at the cost of those living there and trying to use the surrounding land. In fact, even specifying that children would be able to safely play on roads like this because cars wouldn't be able to overtake each other. So a lot of really interesting ideas here, which all kind of coalesce around the social emphasis. There were no nice pictures illustrating this kind of part of the plan, but there was very much an idea which I think took a lot from the lessons learned from British new towns and their social problems, as well as Albury-Wodonga serving as a very helpful precedent, in that a lot of these plans were actually formed with assistance from sociologists and social geographers, and of course, budding social planners, which back then would have been a profession in its relative infancy. So designing a township on the periphery that actually is responsive to people's social needs, I think, is also something which certainly wouldn't have taken place under the kind of status quo suburban development on the periphery that was being advocated by the Board of Works at that time. And another really fascinating thing, which I think also drives home the point of human scale, is cluster housing, which was a very recent sort of, not to say invention, but concept or idea, which came about in Winter Park, which is a housing estate in Doncaster in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. As you can see, the density in these kinds of little estates would have been quite, well, much denser than your standard suburbia, but still with all of the features and benefits of actually living in a spacious kind of place. And these cluster housing developments were located within what Loder and Bailey called neighbourhood cells, which were connected by these green fingers of open space where cars wouldn't drive down, but you could go and play or walk your dog or wherever without being intruded on. So all of these neighbourhood cells were effectively organised around this kind of town nucleus being the civic centre, which was actually one of the few parts of the whole Metrotown project which wouldn't have been profit oriented. The residential areas inevitably would have been up for sale. They would have been subdivided and then sold to private landowners. But the town centre itself would have remained under the jurisdiction and controls of the city of Berwick itself. And that would have not only lent the actual Metrotown itself a strong identity, but also provided a central point for all of these sort of green finger open space networks and public transportation and even roads to coalesce around. And sort of getting towards the beginning of the end, so if this plan was so well thought out, and if there were so many novel and interesting ideas that drew upon the past failures of suburbia and other new towns, why didn't it go well? It's a question we've been thinking about a lot, because sometimes the answer's right there and you don't really realize it's just so simple that it ultimately just comes down to finances. And in the case of Berwick, what was intended by basically slowing down development by way of the Development Areas Act 1973, we found that a lot of the land in that area was basically purchased by people who had heard about the plan early on, bought low-cost farmland, and then just held on to it for a significant amount of time. And then obviously recognising that the government and at the local council, or that the Berwick Development Corporation would need to buy the land to fulfil the plan, increase the prices and thereby make it almost impossible to buy and develop. So it became a local political issue, with landholders essentially putting figureheads forward to go to the council election with the issue as part of their platform. Jack Kirkham being a local farmer, former real estate agent, so he obviously knew the game, basically getting elected on the premise that this should not go ahead because, by their argument, it was inappropriate, it wasn't properly planned, but really it came down to the fact that landholders felt uncomfortable with the idea of acquisition by government and wished to just sell their land at a time when they wanted to sell it on their terms for the best possible price. So it was quite a well-fought battle by numerous community groups. A lot of community groups actually supported the idea of the Green Break and the Metrotown, and obviously the ones that were representative of actual larger landholders were quite against it. And the corridor concept as well seemed to also be quite misunderstood by a lot of people, in terms of people thinking that the entire corridor would have been developed and that something like the Metrotown would have eventually itself sprawled out into its own periphery rather than being self-contained. But in the end, the issue was taken to the election, local councils elected, and for the most part, the concept was basically dead in the water, just as a consequence of the very vocal local residents that didn't want to sell their land. So we see the idea of the Metrotown basically just diffused and returned to the periphery in the sense that it went back to being basically undeveloped farmland for quite a long period of time until market pressures, permitted by the Board of Works and permitted by planning scheme changes over the following 2 decades, to essentially do what people actually feared. And we see that the kind of sprawl that was not desired by the city of Berwick eventually come to dominate the area that was designated for the Metrotown. Not an ideal outcome for anyone involved, except maybe the landholders who got the best possible price for their land. But it's a very interesting sort of arc of taking a part of the periphery, trying to centralize it around itself, and then eventually seeing it return to just that, again, just a peripheral kind of area. So I'm not sure if David wants to jump in with any concluding remarks.
I think you summed it up. I think you summed it up very well, Victoria. It was a reconception of the notion along the lines of something like a satellite city, but with some extra innovation involved. It would have made it quite an extraordinary place. And yes, as you say, for very mundane reasons, it fell in a heap. You know, a victim of democracy in a manner of speaking, possibly also a victim of individual desire for profit.
Thank you very much, Victoria, David, and Nick, the silent presenter. That was really fascinating, and the chat is already on fire with all kinds of suggestions about more modern applications of the technologies you've shown, and you made the connections yourself to the question of land and the question of economics and the question of politics. I think to some degree, I see similarities here with Amanda Colson-Hurley's work on radical suburbs, which some of them had similar kinds of histories. There's a general theme of how these earlier suburban developments actually had a bit of a utopian flair about them. I see some similarities with some of the work that I've done in Los Angeles on public housing on the life's work of Don Parson, who has examined those progressive or even revolutionary ideas about how to expand the city. So there's ample themes here to be explored. Paul, you started us off with questions about technology. Did you want to go deeper on that? Paul, are you with us?
Yes.
I asked whether you wanted to go deeper on the technology question that you raised in the beginning.
No, I'm okay.
No, you okay?
Yeah. I want to give everybody else a chance.
Sorry, one thing I would say about the technology was apparently one of our informants tells us that Loder was not proposing his kind of transport system only for Berwick. He saw that as a kind of the model by which large areas of, I assume, perimeter development in Melbourne and elsewhere would use those kinds of systems, and that they would be in some way interconnected. I don't know how he would imagine that happening, but I do know that when when Loder and Bailey did a report for the South Australian DURD New Town of Metrotown, they also proposed a similar sort of light rail / monorail idea. This is long before the Simpsons, effectively destroyed anybody's monorail proposals forever after as a kind of completely bells and whistles, bread and circuses nonsense.
Hi, yeah, I think there's an important aspect here, and Nick wants to speak in a second. He already asked himself a question in the chat, which I find interesting. I'll remember that as a tactic for future presentations. I let my two co-authors speak, and then I ask them questions. So Nick, I'll let you continue in a second. I'm also reminded with that technology question, and I don't know, obviously, enough of it, and David just expand a little bit on it. But it reminds me also of what Stephen Logan, in his work on what he calls crane urbanism, has talked about, is that the cranes in building these mass housing projects in the suburbs in Eastern Europe actually became a factor, a technological factor, in influencing the way in which the suburbs themselves took shape. So the technology becomes a generative force, not just a means to get things done. Nick.
Hey, yeah, in order to not be a completely silent partner in all of this, but David did point out that Victoria is really the driving force, and you saw that with all the detail that was there on this particular case. Interesting. I mean, history is always written by the powerful, isn't it? And the thing about the New Town idea, and it includes this idea, I think, is just how we forget, how innovative some of the proposals are, how progressive some of them were, but they're easily forgotten. But it's always the negative things that are remembered or hang over some of these proposals, particularly development corporations, where people are going to lose money, or that's how they perceive it. So, whether it's the new towns in the UK, which eventually, we can never do these again in the UK, I guess, because people don't want to lose money through a development corporation. But particularly you see it here where the, interests, landed interests, basically stifled what could have been a very interesting set of proposals and quite innovative. So just that whole issue about what's been lost and what's retained. The negative is kind of retained, as in we can't possibly do it this way because of land values, etc. And then ignoring all the positives, which seems like a kind of fairly general feature. Perhaps internationally, whether we can generalize about that, I'm not sure. So it's more of a comment. The technology stuff is interesting. The idea of the monorail seems to have had this kind of purchase on the imagination at a particular point in time, quite internationally as well. I know there's something called the Tama monorail, which runs through some of the Tokyo suburbs, was actually built. And here we have this idea of a monorail there. And I believe one of the roads out in Berwick was actually, kind of built and drawn out, surveyed in order to be wide enough to accommodate this. So there is actually some modest little legacy somewhere sitting out in Berwick of this transport system that would have been. So yeah, just really a couple of comments to follow up on a couple of things there.
Cool. I just wanted to jump in as well.
Victoria, we soon will have to come to a close of this segment, but please, Victoria, you have the last word.
Oh, I just wanted to note that when it comes to stories like this, with the landed interest, it's quite easy to sort of think of the people as landholders as being some kind of underdog, especially when you've got this context of farming and agricultural land use. The first thing that comes to mind is a poor farmer basically being chased off his land by a development corporation. But I just wanted to note that in the course of doing research, what came to light was actually that it was quite the opposite. With one investigative journalist finding that the people owning land in these areas weren't just speculators, but a lot of the farmers were people who were sort of ex-corporate kind of directors and things like that. Basically, the phrase used is that they were from Collins Street, which is kind of Melbourne's main financial banking street, and that they, for once, were being subjected to a hostile takeover and they weren't happy about it. So that kind of underscores how and why it got politicized. But I just wanted to make a note. It's not quite the underdog story that we thought it was.